Hi, this is Io in a nutshell, or sometimes called EO, but I prefer and will continue to call it Io. So Io is very slightly larger than the Moon and is not too different in density because both the Moon and Io have basically no ice and both of them are about a fourth of the diameter of the Earth and substantially less mass. And Io is the moon that is, of the four Galilean moons, the ones discovered by Galileo in 1610, it's the one the closest to Jupiter, and it is the one most affected by the tidal forces of Jupiter. So here we have Io, which takes about 1.9 days or so to orbit around Jupiter, and Io is here, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. So Io is the one orbiting the fastest, and Io is always facing Jupiter with one face, and because of the tidal forces of Jupiter on Io being very strong, as well as the pull of the other planets, Io, Europa, and Ganymede are all in a resonance, which means every time Io orbits, Ganymede orbits twice, and Europa orbits twice, and Ganymede orbits 4 times. So Io is strongly affected by the tides, and so that's why it has volcanoes. So we can see a volcanic eruption on Io. This loop here was taken from the spacecraft Voyager, and this was a huge surprise. When the spacecraft was on the way to Io, they expected to see an object very much like the Moon, or maybe a combination of the Moon with much more ice and a surface like Callisto. So they expected a version of Callisto, but they found a volcanic object without any ice, spewing out sulfur and oxygen molecules into space. Close-up pictures later, after Voyager, with the Galileo space probe, close-up pictures show that there was lava flows, and so we can see one picture taken here and of the same region at another time, and there's lava flowing here, very clear on the surface of Io. And so Io is the most volcanically active object in the solar system, following with the Earth following behind. So it's more volcanically active than the Earth. Here's a true color image. We can see the very interesting colors and patterns. We can see here, for instance, is a volcano, and we can see this red region here. And this was not here in previous photos, but after the eruption, there was this orange ring around that. All of these are not craters; they are volcanoes. So there's maybe a few hundred volcanoes. And practically there's always a volcano or more than one erupting at any time on Io. And this is because of the tidal forces of Jupiter pulling and stretching the interior as Io orbits around Jupiter. It has a somewhat eccentric orbit, so it gets closer and further away, always showing the same face to Jupiter and being stretched and pulled each orbit, and creating lots of heat in the inside, which then manifests itself with volcanoes on the surface. So here is a picture showing change in the surface due to a volcanic eruption from 1999 with Galileo. New Horizons, the spacecraft that went to Pluto, also flew by Jupiter and took some close-up pictures during that flyby. We can see some changes in the surface here as well, how it looks from time to time, because these volcanoes are constantly changing the surface. Io, unlike Callisto and Ganymede, does not have a lot of craters. It doesn't mean it hasn't been hit. It's been hit many times in the past, but the volcanic resurfacing has occurred much more recently than the impacts. So we don't really see any impact on Io, any impact craters on Io. So in that case, it's also similar to the Earth, that the things that have changed the Earth dramatically, erasing most volcanic activity, and so if we look at the magnetic field of Jupiter, shown schematically here, Io is connected into the magnetic field of Jupiter because it's so close, and one of the things is the volcanoes produce this Io torus, and this is a bunch of atoms, sulfur and oxygen and other atoms, carbon, all orbiting around Jupiter in or near the orbit of Io, because they've left Io, but they still are trapped by the gravity of Jupiter as they orbit around, and they can also be trapped by the magnetic field of Jupiter. So Io also has auroras associated with this connection to Jupiter, and it's got an atmosphere that has some oxygen and some other volcanic gases and particulates, and the atmosphere interacts with the magnetic field, producing auroras, as we see here. The structure of Io is a lot different than the other moons of Jupiter. We don't have the ice, but we have an iron core with sulfur. We have a large mantle and a crust with a thin crust with lots of volcanoes on the surface and very slight atmosphere. Sulfur dioxide is the main cause of the aurora, and volcanoes erupting, and then a torus surrounding Jupiter, that Io is the source of the particles for the torus. And so that is Io in a nutshell.